Greetings and welcome to another video series courtesy of BehaviorAdvisor.com. I'm Tom McIntyre, Dr. Mac as I'm known to many, the developer and coordinator of the aforementioned website. Today, we'll be addressing how to determine a youngster's readiness and willingness to change his or her behavior response pattern for the better, and how we can promote and support that prosocial change. In order to make the video more pertinent to our situations, in just a minute we'll ask our session leader to pause this podcast in order to consider our thoughts regarding some questions. Then our congenial host will restart the video after we've had time to ponder those queries. So, before we move to engage full force in the session, please take a few minutes to ponder the following questions. Have you ever attempted to change a significant part of your personal identity? If so, what was the most difficult part in adopting the new ways? Did you find yourself ever backsliding, forgetting to do these new things, the old ways popping out now and then? And how you doing today? Are you fully free of that habit? Or do you find sometimes the struggle continues? Session leader, please pause the video at this point and call the group back to order and restart the video after we've had a minute or three to reflect upon the queries and share them with a colleague or two who's sitting near us. Welcome back. To a large extent, personal and professional success in one's life is contingent on one's personal character, one's value code, social skills, and behavioral patterns. Youngsters who display persistent, inappropriate actions due to their variance from the norm in the aforementioned personal traits are at significant risk for poor life outcomes. Even though they may recognize that their actions are deemed deviant, undesirable, or otherwise unacceptable by society at large, they are often resistant to changing their antisocial ways. Many frameworks, models, and interventions have been devised to eradicate the misaligned actions of errant youth. Their degree of effectiveness varies widely within groups of kids who possess the same maladaptive behavioral characteristics. Why would this be the case? Why would an intervention work wonderfully with one youngster, but not another? One variable is the major determinant: a youngster's willingness to change his or her ways. Willingness? Yes. Is the student motivated to undertake the arduous process of changing a deeply ingrained way of being? If a youngster is to do more than robotically perform an outward action, we must work on changing the inside, the character and the thought processes, the values and beliefs, the way one perceives oneself. In response to the many educational movements that have misdirected the education of our behaviorally challenged children before being exposed as ineffective, the educational guiding laws in the U.S. now require the elimination of fluff and fads. I trust that this is the case in many other parts of our granite planet too. Government-funded and private websites have been created to promote and share these research-proven practices and interventions with a strong base of evidence. Evidence-based practice provides our kids with interventions and strategies that work. Indeed, the common path for attempting to modify youngsters' errant actions is to select an evidence-based, research-proven strategy that we then implement with fidelity. That professional path is a wise one to follow. However, when we're talking about education and instruction in the behavioral realm, these solid practices are destined for failure if our behaviorally misdirected youth see no reason, no accrued benefits to changing their ways. This outcome is especially pronounced for those intervention-resistant children and youth who exhibit disruptive, impulsive, defiant, and aggressive actions. We're talking about those youngsters who are labeled with mental health conditions such as oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, disruptive behavior, kleptomania, pyromania, substance abuse, intermittent explosive disorder, or are callous in character and unremorseful for their victimization of others or their law-breaking behaviors. Popular from the 1960s to 1990s, Leo Buscaglia, a special ed professor known as Dr. Love by fans of his books and public television appearances, seems to have predicted a model for positive change that would later emerge from medical research and is presented here in this video as it applies to intervention-resistant children and youth with mental health and behavior disorders. In order to better understand resistance to positive change and how we can subdue it, let's take a look at the resistance phenomenon. It's fully explained by the TransTheoretical Model of Change. Originally sketched out by medical professionals, its validity and applicability has been verified in numerous research studies regarding positive behavior change in ingrained lifestyle choices of medical patients. Frequency of exercise, change of diet, smoking cessation, treatment of addictions, and contraceptive use. Given the widespread research-proven utility of the model with regard to positive behavior change in highly resistant and addictive behaviors, its utility and application to youngsters with disordered behavior, whatever the action pattern and cause, is apparent. Here we see the Cliff's Notes overview of the model. It's based on medical research showing its applicability to making changes in one's negative habits and addictions that affects one's physical health. But then comes the question, would the model apply to inappropriate or antisocial behavior patterns that are ingrained in children and youth with mental health and behavioral disorders? So the question continues to arise, can an inappropriate behavior pattern be considered to be an addiction, but a psychological addiction? Being able to determine a youngster's level of mental preparedness for engaging in positive change and knowing which interventions and supports to use in order to increase that readiness is essential in mentally programming behaviorally misdirected children and youth. Session leader, let's get ready to pause the video in just a moment. And during that pause, let's ask the group to revisit the bell work and their former attempts at changing a significant part of their identity. Folks, please reconsider the questions on the screen and, if so inclined, offer to voice one or more of your experiences as they relate to the questions you see and the TransTheoretical Model of Change as you understand it at the moment. Session leader, please pause the video at this point and open the conversation. Restart the video after some stories have been rendered and dissected. Being creatures of habit who exhibit behaviors that have been developed and promoted by beneficial outcomes, either receiving rewards for the actions or escaping punishments, positive and negative reinforcement, individuals commonly resist changing the ways that have worked for them. When attempts at changing one's habitual responses are attempted, the new actions typically develop in a slow and erratic pattern. Very rarely do we witness an epiphany, a single moment of inspiration followed immediately by a permanent remolding of one's behavioral repertoire. Once they are being displayed, these newly acquired ways of acting and reacting are fragile, fully exposed to circumstances that could bring about their demise. For most individuals who attempt to modify or replace ingrained behaviors, change is a prolonged and gradual process with the following stages playing out. When behaviorally challenged children and youth experience consistent, positive interactions with supportive faculty and staff, a curiosity about other ways of behaving develops. Given that history of positive interactions with socially competent and caring adults, or even just one valued role model, kids start to think about whether the adoption of a new value code and action pattern might be beneficial and achievable. When the weighing of the pros and cons of changing one's ways reveals a benefits to drawbacks profile that is more alluring than the present one that's maintaining the aberrant actions, the individual is then motivated to accept the challenge, to undertake the pursuit of new, more prosocial, moral, and ethical value and behavior codes. With increased determination, one resolves to travel a new life path, all in hopes of securing a better and brighter future. With that expanding enthusiasm, the young person undertakes preparation for engaging in the change process, perhaps making a few minor initial attempts at demonstrating new actions. With encouragement and support from adults, the increase in motivation and readiness leads to an active attempt to display those new ways. Those adults must also be supportive when the inevitable setbacks and relapses occur. Youngsters at this stage have embarked on an arduous uphill climb, reaching precarious ledges from which they might tumble. They count on us, the few adults who choose to work with a behaviorally challenged population, to provide them with the equipment, mentorship, and unswerving supportive encouragement that's necessary for them to strengthen and coalesce past and present stages so that they can reach for even higher levels of successful transition to a new life. We enhance the chances of successful transition to a more prosocial outlook and action pattern by repeatedly assessing stages of readiness. This is a process that we'll be discussing a bit later, and supporting these youth in ways that move them to stages of greater readiness and behavioral achievement. It is common for us to perceive our ingrained views of the world and our environmentally sculpted behavior patterns as being the right way. So we're at risk for seeing those with opposing views and ways as the other, and believing that the other ways of valuing and responding are wrong, or at least unsuitable for our purposes. This phenomenon is found in humans of all ilks, whether it be cultural characteristics, religious or political views, or opinions on social issues such as spanking or sexual orientation. People tend to harden their position and dig in their heels when contrary views are put forth. Considering other folks' views and mannerisms as valid risks the chance of becoming disorganized and throwing ourselves into flux. We would have to start anew instead of believing that we're informed and competent. It would require us to surrender the us that we know ourselves to be and recognize and reinvent ourselves. Getting someone of contrary views to see the light, so to speak, is not a quick and simple transition process. Let's return now to the model and how we can utilize it to help kids decide to replace their values and systems. At any moment in time, most of us exist in a pre-contemplation stage. It takes something quite significant to shake up our world and give rise to consideration of other views and ways. Even considering change, as in the contemplation stage, is quite an undertaking. Perhaps the benefits of change are recognized as being superior to those received when showing the present reaction pattern, or maybe the person reaches rock bottom with the present behaviors and finally realizes that those actions are destroying his or her life. Often, it's the bonding with positive role models that inspires errant youngsters to plan and prepare for the change. Sketching out a plan of change is a monumental step for our misdirected youngsters. Leaving behind the ways that have worked, so to speak, for so long is nothing to minimize. Humans show behaviors because there are benefits to doing so. If there wasn't a payoff for displaying our actions, we never would have adopted them in the first place and then kept them. Leaving those responses behind when they are now stimulus response reactions, automatic in nature, and now reacting differently to recurring circumstances is a difficult undertaking, to say the least. It is a bold move to attempt the change in one's ways, given that the present actions have been a significant part of one's life, integral to it. Maintaining the new response pattern is a tenuous endeavor at best. The allure of past response patterns is Lorelei-like. Replacement behaviors feel awkward and ill-fitting when they're first attempted. Relapses, they're to be expected. But to the previously enthused but now anxious youngster, the setbacks can be demoralizing. It can destroy their motivation to continue the attempt to metamorphose themselves. So, how do we determine at which stage the youngster is located at any point in time? And how do we move the young person to higher levels? With the Behavior Transformation Guide, the BTG. It's a diagnostic prescriptive instrument that assists you in guiding errant youngsters onto prosocial, productive life paths. For the next minute, I'll describe how it does so, and then we'll get right back to the model and talk about how we might approach and address the matters that are prominent at each stage. You'll be using these and other materials later on during our case study activity. As for the diagnostic part of this diagnostic prescriptive instrument, here's a quick assessment from the student's perspective, what we call the ready ruler. There are many other instruments that are completed by adults who know this child well, and several that are completed with the youngster. In this student report version, you see that markings from 0 to 3 on the scale lead to suggested mentor questions on the next page. And of course, there are questions that follow for a mark that is made further up the line. One part of the Behavior Transformation Guide, it is known as the BARC, the Behavior Assessment Rating Checklist. Adults complete rating scales with indicators of each particular scale. For example, these items that you see here from the Behavior Transformation Guide are a few of the many that help to determine whether the youngster is operating at the action stage. At the end of the item list is a general overall rating scale that indicates what has become apparent from completing the listing of items. Once we identify the stage in which the student is operating, the Diagnostic Prescriptive Behavior Transformation Guide package provides strategies for solidifying and advancing the progress that was made by the youth. Please note the many hyperlinks to what to do and how to do it material that I developed and can be found on behavioradvisor.com. So, in essence, the Behavior Transformation Guide package contains an overview of the model and its applicability to children and youth whose behavior patterns are of great concern. It prepares the user to utilize the various assessment instruments that are completed by the youngster and the other ones that are completed by adults who know that young person. Once the stage of readiness is identified, concerned and caring adults such as us can implement the various strategies that are designed to move the kids to higher levels of readiness and willingness to engage in more appropriate actions. And yes, you will have an opportunity to make use of these diagnostic prescriptive materials later today when we engage in the evaluation of and planning for a hypothetical student. First though, please join me for parts 2 and 3 of our activity-filled video series in which we will become more familiar with how to assess a youngster's stage of readiness and willingness to engage in positive behavior change. You'll become knowledgeable in the model and our intervention approaches to youngsters who are situated in different stages of readiness and motivation. Session leader, please let the gathering know how much time is allotted for the break while you queue up part 2 of our video series.